Hello, my name is Ruby Hessing, a master's degree candidate in the Special Education Department here at Cleveland State University. This is my presentation entitled Intervention or Interference, the Issue of Special Education Misidentification. First, let's stretch our brains a bit. How much do you know about special education law? Click the banner link to take an online quiz from funtrivia.com that will test your knowledge. After you are done, return to this video and resume the presentation. Welcome back. Now that you have taken your quiz, you may be a little more familiar with what special education law is about. Now let's explore further. Special education law was fairly recently put into practice to provide fair access to education for those who qualify under the standards outlined by the law. However, since its initial passage and reauthorization, special education law has not always been utilized effectively. The U.S. Department of Education states that students receiving special education services have been gradually on the rise in this country since the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, was enacted until 2005. On the next slide, we will review some trends on the number of students receiving special education. If you review the data from the U.S. Department of Education, you will see that from 1976 to 2005, the number of students receiving these services increased. If you click on the banner, you will be able to see more detail on these data points from the U.S. Department of Education Educational Statistics website. Just looking in the first line of the chart here, you will see that the total number of students among all disability categories increased from 3,694 in 1976 to 6,719 in 2004. In the year 2004, IDEA was reauthorized with new requirements. This explains the subsequent downtrend in the years following. I will further explain this relationship later in the current policy portion of this presentation. Moreover, as the title suggests, my presentation topic is on the issue of the misuse of special education that results in a racially stratified school, wherein most special education programs contain a disproportionate amount of minorities that do not necessarily have a special need or a need that can be remedied by special education intervention. Through a review of the literature, I have examined the phenomenon of overrepresentation of minorities in special education and the reasons behind it. I will also outline my recommendations for solving this problem, including presenting alternative programs that can resolve this special education phenomenon. These and other programs have been backed by the current research to reduce the number of minorities receiving special education resources unnecessarily. We already reviewed a little bit about current special education law through our online quiz and introduction. On the next slide, we will go into a little more detail of the history surrounding the legislation in special education. Okay, now we will move on to the key dimensions of overrepresentation in special education. I would like to begin with the Associated Special Education history. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975 was first initiated as part of the nation's evolving commitment to accommodate the needs of all children in public schools. However, soon after its passage of this historic legislation, policymakers became concerned about the upward trend of disabled students in public schools. In 2004, IDEA was reauthorized through the No Child Left Behind Act, which restructured the special education identification process to include more facets of the students besides their achievement record. To outline this social issue's impact on education, I will explain how the Hochschild and Skowronek framework categorizes this phenomenon. Then I will give examples from both the Noguera and Lyle's texts that iterate the impact this social issue has on the education of minorities. Firstly, the Hochschild and Skowronek framework would describe this problem as a disservice to the collective good. The American Dream and the Public Schools states on page 13, one collective goal holds that schools must help to provide equal opportunity for all children. However, we read in the Noguera text that the placement of minorities into special education is not an equal opportunity. In Chapter 4 of Noguera's City Schools and the American Dream, we read about unequal outcomes and opportunities. At Berkeley High School, it was mentioned that many of the minority children drop out, and the special education program is disproportionately populated with minorities. However, the chapter goes on to say that white children are successful in the school. This leads to the all-important question of why. Because according to H&S framework, a successful education system cannot continue if this practice ensues. As the Lyle's text illustrated in Chapter 11, this classification as a special needs student can come about in response to a tragic event in a child's life. And once classified, the child feels stuck in a cycle of lower teacher expectations and lower quality of student work. As quoting Sugar Babe in Chapter 11, I enjoyed the slow class. Nothing was expected of me and I delivered. Freed from academic expectation, reading and fantasizing became my basic curriculum. In my review of the literature, Gian et al. Cited an article of Peterson et al. In 2004 to say that IDEA allows each state to set eligibility criteria. This, of course, we know creates a system where standards are not the same across the board, and school systems can basically do what they please with special education. An article by Entwistle agrees with the Gian article to say that special education identification processes and practices are not standardized. These can vary from one school district to the other depending on district mandates. All this means that a student that qualifies in one district may or may not qualify in another district, and thus may have a break in their educational track. Learning disabilities are indicated by a marked discrepancy between ability and performance, but often the category is used as a catch-all. This ultimately means if a teacher believes that the student cannot be helped in the general classroom, they can be put into special education. My last article is by Edel, and this research article went on to say that there's evidence that racial differences in educational placement are related to the structures of opportunity in school districts and communities they serve, and that the placement process should be the focus of continued study. Considering all of this information, these are my proposed dilemmas and concerns. More and more children that are outliers on the academic bell curve for non-academic reasons are dumped into special education. These children do need intervention. However, they do not always need special education, and some also may need special education in conjunction with other interventions. No distinction is specifically made when a child has an academic deficit for other reasons that are non-academic. Special education becomes a dumping ground for those children teachers don't know how to help. On the next slide, we'll consider some specific cases. Considering the case study of a New York Times article. A 2005 article in the New York Times described the debate in Connecticut public schools of minority overrepresentation in special education. The article stated, "The students are being placed in special education because educators are misinterpreting behavior problems and misunderstanding cultural differences. No one race should have a disproportionate number of disabled children. You would expect it to be proportionate to the demographics of that community." And this is Dr. Nancy Capello stating this. There should be no overrepresentation. And you can click the banner link to see more of the article, but these are just some specific details that go along with the context of this social issue. And this is not the only article. There are many other articles that state similar cases, including the Washington Post and the Florida Times Union. And I also have banner links for those articles as well for your perusal. Furthermore, these instances are anecdotal evidence of a need to further review the identification processes and procedures for special education programs. So to quickly recap, mainly the issue stands that school systems have no place for students from minority backgrounds whose home life and social-emotional status affects their academic career. The students that are placed in special education intervention programs remain in them because the programs do not solve their problems to help them succeed academically. Many times, as in Sugar Babe's case, the students become worse off academically in special education programs because their academic self-efficacy is then affected. Now, on the next slide, you'll review a YouTube video that outlines some of the circumstances surrounding the issue of teachers making these choices to put minorities in special education programs. Major educational policies in response to this issue include No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind statutes were used to address the issue of misidentification. These statutes redefine the special needs student. However, loopholes still left the opening for schools to define more subjective disability categories, such as ADD, ADHD, and emotional disabilities. The research has proved this initiative to be somewhat effective because the overall designation of students receiving special education services decreased. However, the proportion of minorities in special education is still disproportionate compared to the white peers in the school. I wanted to present some policy research since the current efforts have failed, and I wanted to further illustrate what this disproportionality really means. In quoting a Green 2005 article, more than 2.2 million children of color are receiving special education services in schools across the United States. According to the National Research Council, more than 14% of African American students are in special education, compared with 13% of American Indian students, 12% of white students, 11% of Hispanic students, and 5% of Asian American students. African American students are almost 3 times as likely as white students to be labeled mentally retarded, 2 times as likely to be labeled emotionally disturbed, and 1.3 times as likely to be labeled having a learning disability. According to the National Institute for Urban School Improvement, African Americans are significantly overrepresented in the 2 special education categories of high incidence disabilities and emotional behavioral disorders. And then the same article goes on to say, as the problem of overrepresentation of African American students persists, despite the removal of intelligence tests from the assessment process. Moreover, ongoing professional development is a key component to successful implementation of a culturally responsive assessment. So this article entails outlining culturally responsive interventions instead of special education interventions as the sole intervention to help minority students, especially African American students, succeed in the public school system. So finally, I give my recommendations for the resolution of this social issue. And firstly, my overarching recommendation to this overrepresentation of minorities in special education would be to provide more intervention programs for minority students to succeed in school. Going by Cerna et al. 1988, experimentally validated interventions that have been found to be validated across cultures can begin to address the issue of disproportionate representation. We can use the response to intervention model, which was mentioned in Brown-Chisty 2007. As the figure to the right displays, this is a three-tiered intervention to prevent academic failure. The three tiers are primary or prevention for at-risk students, secondary, and tertiary. This is following the public health response to care model. This model ensures that educators will respond to at-risk students before major deficits occur. As we all know, major deficits in academic progress result in a high risk for dropouts later on. We also must provide necessary services in schools to prevent deficits, whether they use the RTI model or not. Reading intervention services, for example, like America Reads. Sometimes children need someone to help them with reading until they feel comfortable reading on their own. And as we know, we need to get the children reading as early as possible before third grade because they switch over from learning to read to reading to learn. So it's very important to have these programs to get them reading more and get them interested in reading. Other school-based academic support programs should be initiated. These programs can be tailored to the individual school or environment and consider needs that are unique to the individualized school's population. For example, an elementary school in Maryland, actually my old elementary school, initiated a student mentoring program for reading skill building. So it was like a buddy program where older students help younger students read. Basic needs services include social services, healthcare services, food programs, whatever the kids need that can affect their learning, because we all know that basic needs to come before actual learning happens. So if they're not getting food at home, if they're not healthy, if their familial needs aren't met, if they're homeless, what have you, these things are going to affect academics. So they need to be taken care of first. As always, supportive educators and funding is necessary to implement and maintain these programs. Mainly if the teachers don't support these programs, they don't advocate for these programs for their students will not get ahead because these programs won't be there. Also, more research needs to be done on this issue to find out the root causes and correlations pertaining to this issue. Additionally, programs research should be completed to validate the effectiveness of alternative learning programs. Now we are pulling it all together. Overrepresentation is still a problem in schools. Many schools have a disproportionate number of minorities in special education. Current national legislative efforts to decrease the phenomenon have failed. The number of overall students in special education has decreased, but the proportions of minorities in special ed remain disproportionate compared to white peers. Now we are pulling it all together. Overrepresentation is still a problem in schools. Many schools have a disproportionate number of minority students in special education. Current national legislative efforts to decrease this phenomenon have failed on a broad scale. The numbers of overall students in special education have decreased since 2004, but the proportions of minorities in special education remain disproportionate to that of white peers. Alternate intervention programs need to be planned, funded, and implemented. Then minority students will be less likely to end up in special ed and more likely to achieve academically. I really want to know what you think. Click the banner link to take a poll and share your opinion on the matter.